Hey everybody, it's Mr. McKeever here, and today we're going to talk about, Europe devolving into violence again, because, why not? That's kind of what they do. Alright, despite all the great altruistic notions of the Enlightenment, it doesn't change the fact that the political nation and nature of Europe is just real adversarial. And the 17th century is 1700s, the 18th century is by no means going to be an exclusion from that. It is going to be a period of time where we actually will begin an era of European history where violence will not stop for well over 100 years. There is no peace in Europe, and it's just a rough, bloody period of time. So, violence becomes an issue. The growth of European empires around the world means there are now more opportunities for countries to interact and be forced to deal with each other and to fight over things and to deal with confrontation. And that just leads to a massive influx of global conflict. Thank you, imperialism, for leaving a little bit of a violent legacy in the 18th century. So, what causes them to fight? Well, there's going to be two significant reasons. One, very straightforward, is the imperialistic aspects of things. The desire for colonies around the world and the money that they produce is going to lead to conflicts. That's pretty straightforward. The second thing is going to be nationalism. The desire to prove that you are better than everyone else, that your nation is better than everyone else, is also going to lead us to conflict as well. But that one we're going to explain a lot more a little bit later on. Today we're going to try to focus largely on the imperialistic aspect of things, and then how that begins to just spiral events out of control. So, let's talk about our first conflict, probably the most bizarrely named conflict in all of European history, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Not a misnomer, not a mistake, that is the actual name of the conflict. War of Jenkins' Ear. So, how does someone's ear lead to a European conflict? Well, let me tell you a tale. So, back in the day, remember how they used to have pirates who stole stuff from ships across the Atlantic Ocean? Particularly the British used to do that a lot to the Spanish. Well, that's exactly what happens. A British captain, or pirate, depending on your perspective, by the name of Robert Jenkins is caught stealing stuff from Spanish ships. And when he does, the punishment he receives is literally someone chopping off his ear. The British will be so outraged the Spanish would do this, violence breaks out. Most bizarre conflict ever. So, this is significant, not because of any territorial changes or anything like that, but because it begins the era of 100 years of nonstop violence. The War of Jenkins' Ear is relatively simple. Let's be truthful. The British are going to destroy the Spanish. They're not even in the same ballpark of balance of power at this point in time, but it has begun. Conflict will continue to happen nonstop for the next 100 years, and our next conflict we talked about is one that we've already actually brought up before, and that's the War of Austrian Succession. This is the war about Maria Theresa. When she immediately becomes Queen of Austria, Frederick II is going to invade to try to take some territory from her. That conflict has happened. The point of all of this is now the violence has begun. It will not stop. Conflict after conflict after conflict, particularly the conflict between Austria and Prussia, is going to be a driving force through a lot of what happens. Those two nations are just going to fight it out a lot. So, the War of Austrian Succession is going to bring to light the reality that political alliances are changing in Europe. And it actually has a lot to do with the British, not just because they're a major player, but because with the ascension of William and Mary as the monarchs in England, we now have a family that is not British. They're German. Their child, George, is a German descendant. So it's not shocking at all when the British are going to turn their allegiance instead of Austria, instead of Russia or anything like that. They become allies with Prussia. And this is an issue for two very, very important reasons. One, it's going to alienate France. France is now sandwiched between their two greatest rivals, the Prussians and the British. That's going to be an issue that's going to rear its head. Two, at this point in time, Prussia had the strongest military in Europe. The British had the strongest navy in Europe. So now the balance of power is all sorts of wonky. And this diplomatic revolution that takes place is going to have a rippling effect across Europe. Prior to this, it was England and Austria were allies. They were cemented together. If one went to war, the other one went to back them up. Prussia and France, allies. We got this. We're great. All is good. Now it's not. France is going to have to turn to Austria because now it views Prussia as an enemy. The British and the French have been rivals for hundreds of years up to this point in time. Now that the Prussians are allied with the English, there are their threats, right? And there's one on each side of their country. They're freaking out. Everything's starting to fall apart if you're the French. This diplomatic revolution has a massive impact on Europe. And just wait till Catherine becomes involved in Europe and starts playing into this as well. When she changes alliances from Prussia to Austria, now we're making things even more interesting. All the balance is broken. So now it's time for another conflict. We've had Jenkins' Ear. We have Austrian succession. Now we have the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in the United States. So what is this conflict? Well, it's complicated, but not at the same time. What happens is, I'm going to show you a map here. This map really breaks down everything that exists in this period. This begins as a conflict in the New World, when you had British colonists who are looking to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains into what is generally called like the Ohio Valley and continue to push farther and farther west. Well, that's where the French are. That's where they've done their fur trading. They are allied with the Native Americans there, and fighting is going to break out in this colonial territory. And when that happens, of course, there's going to be fighting in other parts of the world. Remember, these two nations are competing pretty much everywhere. The French and the British are fighting in India over who's going to replace the Mughal Empire. And the rivalry in Europe is by no means going to go away. Now, especially that you have this diplomatic revolution where the French feel slighted, conflict breaks out in Europe. So depending on where you're talking about the fighting, it has that different name. If it's in the Americas, it's the French and Indian War. If it's in anywhere else in the world, it's called the 7 Years' War. But what is the end result? Well, welcome to the world's first World War. Fighting takes place on 3 different continents, officially qualifying it as an international global conflict. It is 7 years of off and on fighting, and the end result is going to be that England wins. They will become the undisputed power on the American continent. The French are, for all intents and purposes, kicked out of North America. Of course, there are still French traders out there, but the French government's going to have pretty much no impact on what goes on there anymore. Also, England is now the dominant power in Europe. It's not undisputed, but it's significant. The French are, for all intents and purposes, kicked out of the entire Western Hemisphere at this point. The only areas that they will have left will be an island in the Caribbean called Haiti, and meh. Then eventually they also have the Louisiana territory, but people don't really know what that is yet. Hindsight, huge for us, but they didn't care about that. They didn't know it was on the other side of the Mississippi at this point in time. All they really knew was the Ohio Valley, and the French are kicked out of that. And actually, they are going to eventually realize that since they had what they viewed as very little actual land in the New World, that's one of the reasons why they sell it to the United States later on. Side note. The other aspect of this is that the 7 Years' War is going to be extraordinarily expensive, and then it's going to have a ripple effect as well. Because the British don't want to actually pay for it, they decided to make the Americans pay for it. The American colonists, feeling like they've gotten slighted, are now going to become very anti-British. They are now being forced to pay in taxes for a conflict they didn't start, technically, by a government they don't have any representation in. So now, transition to our next situation. Cost of the 7 Years' War make the Americans really upset, leading to the American Revolution. But we know the story of the American Revolution. We're not going to go through and rehash all of that stuff. It's a great story. You really should know more about the nuances of the Founding Fathers themselves. They are not demigods. They are not these glorious, pious human beings. They are extraordinarily flawed. They are extraordinarily petty. And they're just fun as hell to learn about. That's a different story for next year. Hopefully you catch on to that. But man, that rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson is soap opera glory, gold, wonderfulness. All right. So why does this matter to this class? We are not an American history class. Well, the ripple effects of the American Revolution are pretty monumental. One, the English's first empire is crippled, right? The North American continent is now kind of broken away. Well, this is going to redouble English efforts in India, which, to be fair, they viewed as a more important colony anyways. They have to win that conflict with France now, and they will. Better colony, more people, more luxurious resources. Two, the French used the American Revolution as an opportunity to screw over the British. That rivalry is getting worse. The French are absolutely instrumental in the Americans having a shot at winning. If it isn't for the help of the Marquis de Lafayette, the United States loses. It is, without question, the French saved the American colonists and the American Revolutionary Forces. So this conflict between the British and the French is not going away. It's just a next step. Lastly, probably most importantly, this notion that the colonists can break away, that popular government, like what appears in the United States upon its independence, is going to be a massive source of inspiration for the French Revolution. So conflict leads to conflict, leads to conflict, leads to conflict. The War of Jenkins' Ear will bring us to the War of Austrian Succession, which will bring us to the 7 Years' War, which will bring us to the American Revolution, which will bring us to the French Revolution, which in turn will bring us to the Napoleonic Wars, which in turn will bring us to the revolutions of 1848, which will lead to significant conflict after significant conflict in European history. An era of just unadulterated violence has broken out, despite all of the hopes and dreams of the great Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, Rousseau and Locke. Violence is now the way we do things in Europe for a while. Have a great day, folks. Aren't we cool? Peace out.